Hello and welcome to the Nona Boss Audits and Investigations. And thank you for joining me for another episode of the Scientology Chronicles. Today, we are going to talk a little bit more about Delores Stokes and Shea. And they are two characters, more Delores Stokes, but two characters that I already covered in a live that I did, a live show in episode 2. So I'm going to just refresh your memory. And this is a photograph of Delores Stokes and Shea. And just so that you guys have a little context of who we are talking about today. The one thing that was very disturbing, in my opinion, regarding Delores Stokes is there was a interview done with Mr. Marvin Feldman. And in that interview with Mr. Marvin Feldman, he described one of his encounters with her. And right here in the very first paragraph, this is what he had to say about Delores Stokes. He had also described having sexual intercourse with Delores Stokes, a quote unquote clear who at one time was Hubbard's personal secretary. Stokes had propositioned him by stating, "I have removed my hat of Scientology and have put on my sexual hat." And he also described an auditing session with Stokes admitting to having sexual relations with other students. And Stokes related such misdeeds to Walter. Walter berated him for about an hour for act or acts, but then concluded by telling him he could get straight by paying $200. That was a brief description of some of the testimony that we covered in episode 2, and that was back in 1963. And now we're going to look at another document from 1963 where it's very interesting. This investigation was conducted as a result of a memo of January 24th, 1963, a letter from the Veterans Administration Hospital in Waco, Texas, dated September 22nd, 1960, from H.C. Mitchell, MD, to Mr. Philip R. Overton of Texas Medical Association in Austin, Texas, gave the names of Shea, Delores Stokes, and Andy and Carolyn Gilland in the Dallas-Fort Worth area who were practicing Scientologists at the time. Church of Scientology of Dallas was listed in the current Dallas telephone directory. On February 13th, 1963, notice of inspection was issued to Mrs. Delores Stokes, spiritual counselor of the Church of Scientology of Dallas. Credentials were shown to Mrs. Stokes and to Carolyn Gilland, a minister of the church. Mrs. Stokes informed the inspectors that the following were the only people with authority in the Church of Scientology of Dallas: a Mr. William D. Shea, resident minister who resides at Mockingbird Lane, Dallas, Texas. Born in Massachusetts in 1917 and was formerly a special agent for the Prudential Insurance Company in Dallas, Texas. Mrs. Carolyn Gillan, minister, resides at Hillcrest, Irving, Texas, formerly lived at Catchin Drive, Fort Worth, Texas. Mrs. Delores Stokes, a credit auditor and spiritual counselor, resided at Colony Court in Dallas, Texas. During 1958 and 1959, Mrs. Stokes was employed as a clerk for the Small Business Administration in Dallas, Texas. The inspectors were also introduced to a Gary Moore, a member or a counselee of the church, who was there at the time of our visit. During our interview with Mrs. Stokes and Mrs. Gillen, Gary Moore was requested to leave the room since he had no authority in the church. We explained the nature of our visit to Mrs. Stokes and Mrs. Gillen, and we required as to the use of the Hubbard e-meter in their work. Mrs. Stokes informed the inspectors that the Church of Scientology of Dallas operated as a branch of the founding Church of Scientology, Washington, D.C., and that the church holds a franchise from Hubbard's communication office worldwide, St. Hill Manor, East Grinstead, Sussex, England. Mrs. Stokes stated that at the present time, the founding Church of Scientology of Texas is located in Houston, Texas, but the lady in charge at Houston was retiring and negotiations are now in progress to move the headquarters of the Texas organization to Dallas. When asked where the e-meters were obtained, Mrs. Stokes stated that Mr. Shea's and hers had come from England. Mrs. Gillen stated that she had obtained hers in Washington, D.C., and when asked how many e-meters she had, Mrs. Gillen replied that we were getting beyond our scope in requesting this information, and we did not pursue this further. We then asked to see the e-meters and were then taken into a quote-unquote counseling room where one e-meter was on a table and Mrs. Gillen brought another e-meter into the room. They were both labeled Hubbard electrometer for use in Scientological clearing, patent pending. Mrs. Stokes then explained the operation of the e-meter. This is a transistor battery type Wheatstone bridge, which passes a current through the body, and the dial on the meter measures this current as resistance or in changes of density that occur within the body. This is accomplished when the counselee completes the circuit by holding a terminal in each hand consisting of two can-like objects. Mrs. Stokes stated that the e-meter was used only as an indicator to establish in what area a person's Mrs. Stokes stated that the e-meter was used only as an indicator to establish in what the needle on the e-meter falls to the Mrs. Stokes stated that the e-meter was used only as an indicator to establish in what area a person's problems lie. If signs of grief or depression appear, the needle on the e-meter falls to the right. Mrs. Stokes then asked Mrs. Gillen to hold the terminal cans and to tell her a lie. A lie is supposed to make the needle fall to the right. Mrs. Gillen then stated, I like the leaky faucets in my house. The meter dial did not move. And Mrs. Stokes stated that the battery was weak, and this was the cause of its not registering. Mrs. Stokes continued that when an area of disturbance is located, a routine of questioning in this particular area is used. This helps the person gain more control over himself physically and mentally and makes him more aware of himself as a spiritual being, and in this way helps his family, and he becomes aware of how his problems can be solved by himself. Mrs. Stokes explained Mrs. Stokes explained that the areas of disturbance could be located without e-meter. However, the e-meter saved the counselor time. When asked if there was any particular procedure they followed in counseling, Mrs. Stokes replied that no definite procedure was followed. An introductory course is given by Mr. Shea. A course in communicating is given by Mrs. Stokes. On Sunday afternoon, they have discussion sessions, and some counselees or members will come in and play tapes. It is up to the individual counselor whether or not the e-meter would be employed in counseling. Sorry, guys. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen. I just keep thinking back to her unauthorized sexual proposition of Mr. Feldman. I find it interesting that she is, some loosely, she's kind of, sometimes it's followed and sometimes it's not. And I don't know, just kind of depends. She's an operator, this lady. Okay, let's move on. The inspectors were allowed to copy the Church of Scientology creed. While this was being done, Mrs. Stokes remarked that this was not bad at all, referring to their investigation. She stated that she had heard that in Washington, they had kicked around the e-meters and seized unconstitutionally religious books, personal property, and broken up counseling sessions. The inspectors asked Mrs. Stokes what literature they had. She provided a book list from the distribution center and checked the books which they had on hand. Copies of this list are attached to this memorandum. Mrs. Stokes at this time informed the inspectors that she and Mrs. Gillen were supposed to have appointments now, and we would have to conclude our visit. Prior to leaving, the inspectors made appointments to see the resident minister, William Shea, the next morning, and also an appointment to talk to Mrs. Gillen privately. Prior to leaving, the inspectors made appointments to see the resident minister, William D. Shea, the next morning, and also an appointment to talk to Mrs. Gilland privately. Mrs. Stokes informed us that she would not be available for another interview until the following week. However, she stated we could contact her tomorrow for a definite time. On February 14th, 1963, another visit was made to Scientology of Dallas. The resident minister, William Shea, interviewed. Mr. Shea stated that he would be unable to give us any information since this church's lawyer had informed him to keep quiet. Asked Mr. Shea who he had called. And he stated that Mrs. Stokes had called the founding Church of Scientology in Washington, D.C., and talked with John Fudge, who had told her to call Oscar Brinkman, the lawyer, on 18th Street, Northwest Washington, D.C. Shea stated that he was to obtain a copy of our report of the previous day's visit. He was informed that this would have to be requested through Washington. When asked how he got started, Shea replied that he first heard of Scientology in 1956 or 1957 from a friend and went to the College of Ministers in Washington, D.C. for a course in 1958. Shea was asked how long it took to go through the course, and he replied that depended on the individual. He stated that you could obtain a certified auditor certificate in as little as 5 months up to 2 years, depending on the amount of effort exerted. Depending on the amount of effort exerted. A minister's certificate was stated to be obtained in the same length of time, all depending on the amount of effort applied. Shea stated that the test for the minister degree required a full day's examination in which you must have a basic understanding of the 8 major religions. Shea informed us that he had just returned from England in December of 1962 after spending 8 months at a school in England. The school was reportedly run by L. Ron Hubbard. Shea stated that they did not operate as an organized religion, but Scientology is a way of life. And you get so involved in it, you forget about any monetary aspects. However, Shea stated that donations had helped offset his expenses of going to England. Shea informed us that he, Mrs. Stokes, and Mrs. Gilland were the only people with authority in the Church of Scientology of Dallas, and that he and Mrs. Stokes were both divorced. The inspectors were allowed to copy the awards, which were displayed on the office wall. We asked if Mr. Gillen was active, and Mr. Shea indicated that Mr. Gillen had a certified auditor certificate, but that he was a pilot and he had just finished giving Mr. Gillen's course. Shea stated that he was starting a self-advancement course on Monday evening and told Mrs. Stokes to prepare invitations for us. Mrs. Stokes brought the invitations and handed them to the inspectors and stated she would like a copy of our report of our interview with her the preceding day. We informed Mrs. Stokes that such a request could be made to Washington. Mr. Shea was asked for a list of members of the church, and he declined to furnish it to us. Mr. Shea was asked if they did any advertising, and he stated that they were listed in the yellow pages of the telephone directory. Mr. Andrew Gillen was interviewed in regard to his connection with Church of Scientology and with the use of the e-meter. Gillen is presently employed by Neville Penrose, Inc., Fort Worth, Texas, as a private pilot. He's currently residing at Route 9, Fort Worth, Texas. Gillen stated that he was 38 and was born March of 1924. He and his wife formerly lived in Fort Worth, Texas, but they have been separated and divorced since November of 1962. Carolyn Gilland formerly operated the Church of Scientology Fort Worth at their former home, but she is now working as a minister at the Church of Scientology in Dallas. Mr. Gillen stated that he became interested in Scientology after he had read the book Dianetics, Modern Science of Mental Health in the spring of 1959. He continued that he had been in an airplane wreck during the Korean War and didn't know how he had gotten out of it. After reading the book Dianetics, his wife book audited him and he remembered how he had escaped. Prior to this time, this had been an emotional problem with him. After this, he decided to go to Washington to school for the benefit of his own problems. Gillen took an 8-week course in Washington during August and September of 1959. Gillen was asked if he adhered to the principles of Scientology, and he replied that there is not much principles to it. The main thing I got, so I was responsible for my own problems. Let me say that again, ladies and gentlemen. Gilland was asked if he adhered to the principles of Scientology. And he replied that there is, quote unquote, not much principle to it. The main thing I got, so I was responsible for my own problems, quote unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, is this the clear cognition? Hmm, interesting. Okay, let's get back to it. We'll move on. Gillen went on to explain that during the first 5 weeks of the course in Washington, the e-meter was not used. This period consisted of lectures, both tapes and oral, and pairing off with another student in which one would be the student auditor and the other the pre-clear. The e-meter was introduced to the class. The e-meter was introduced to the class during the last 3 weeks of the course. First introduction was principles of the e-meter. Then the students used the e-meter on each other. When you have a change in emotion, the meter of the e-meter will measure this emotion. This is measured when the needle changes from normal level. And the book told us how to recognize certain patterns of the needle. The e-meter is somewhat like a lie detector. When an area of disturbance or emotion is uncovered by the use of the e-meter, a routine of questioning is used until this area clears. According to Gillen, no other instrument or device was used in the treatment. We're going to jump right down into the tail end of this, and he says, it is interesting to note that during our interview with W.D. Shea in Dallas, he stated that Gillen had just finished taking a course from him. However, during our interview with Gillen, no mention was made of this course. In a memo dated January 24th, 1963, it is stated that the e-meter is a religious instrument for use as a part of the confessional of the founding church of Scientology. However, no mention was made of the e-meter as part of the confessional during our interviews with any of the individuals contacted. I find that interesting, don't you, ladies and gentlemen? It's a little interesting little tidbit in this interview and the observations of the investigators. Okay. Outside investigation of William D. Shea, Mrs. Delores Stokes, and the Gillens revealed the following information. The sheriff's office of Dallas County had an information card dated September 1953 on William Dollard Shea, showed the arrest of William Shea on February 25th, 1950, as a result of an accident, DND. I think that's drinking and driving. So he had a DUI. Okay. The Highland Park Police Department had the following records on William Shea: drunk in car to jail. That's what it says. William D. Shea, Cedar Springs, April 11th, 1959, drunk in car to jail. Speed warning, paid $70 fine. Another record on Shea listed Shea William Dollard, disturbing the peace, and he went to the county jail. Highland Police Department had no records on either of the Gillards or Mrs. Stokes. However, the following information was obtained on a Miriam Shea, wife of William D. Shea. Miriam Shea, dated October 30th, 1960, drunken party in bed, no clothing. Men and women. November 24th, 1960, loaned car to James Monroe Day. His license suspended for DWI, issued ticket for permitting unlicensed driver. Police checks were also made at North Richland Hills Police Department and Tarrant County Sheriff's Office for information on Carolyn Gillen. None of the aforementioned departments had any records of these individuals. In Dr. Mitchell's letter of September 1960, stated Red Shea and Delores Stokes practicing at Dallas, Texas, in an attempt to determine when the office was moved. City directories since 1958 were checked, and not only for the address of the Church of Scientology, but also for the names William Shea and Delores Stokes. Sounds like Red Shea had a drinking problem. But then again, she was the one that was having drunken parties with no clothes on. Um, all I gotta say is I think the Dallas crew, this Dallas crew were some rockin' people, having sexual encounters with the people that they audit and then shaking those people down for money. So they were like pimps and hookers and drunks and yeah, so there was a lot going on back in the day at the Dallas Church of Scientology. And it's pretty I just find it interesting to kind of get a little more background on some of these people as I come across different characters, uh, or shall I say, bad actors in Scientology and these Scientologists, and uh, I think it's some of it's very comical if you think about it in that context. So, anyways, let me know in the comments what you guys think. Do you have any further thoughts on Delores Stokes or Red Shea? Let me know in the comments what you think about finding out some more information on Delores Stokes and the hats she likes to wear. And Red Shea with his drunk and disorderly and his DWIs. And, I think he spent a little bit of time in jail, maybe a little bit, probably a little bit. Well, thank you guys for being here for another episode. And please remember, kids cannot consent. No more kids in Scientology. And please remember to spread love and kindness wherever you go. And I'll catch you on the next one.